Hi, I'm Stephen Bruce. I run the Academy of Physical Medicine, and here's 45 minutes of free CPD for you. This is just an example of what we do. We run a free session every month, along with 70 plus hours of live learning with others CPD every year. If you'd like to see more, click the link in the info section below the video, and that'll take you through to our website. Enjoy. Good evening to you and welcome to this evening's broadcast, which of course concerns regulation, in particular chiropractic regulation. Although I imagine there's going to be lots of crossover with osteopathy as we go through the topics that we had under the hammer this evening. I have to say, I've been really pleased to see so many new names register with us for this evening's show. Hopefully that's going to make the conversation even more lively than usual, because I think we had about 200 new names sometime this afternoon when I saw the last count. If you are one of those newcomers, then obviously I hope you'll check out all the other things we can do for you. But for the moment, welcome. It's great to have you on board. Before we start, I'd just like to say that I hope you aren't too concerned about the idea of an osteopath quizzing the GCC's registrar about regulation of the chiropractic profession. I'm hoping, of course, that I can bring something useful into the mix, but basically I was really grateful for a message that we received only this morning from Sophia, because Sophia said, I just want to say how great it is that you're bringing our professional communities together, and she added some clappy hands as well. Well, yeah, that means a lot, Sophia, because I've often stated that one of my aims is to do just that, and to overcome that sort of tribal hostility that we've all encountered from time to time. Personally, I think we've got so much in common, and we are definitely stronger together than we are if we spend our time sniping at each other. So again, thank you, Sophia. And one more on the topic of working together, and this is not something I've ever done before. I had a lovely message earlier from Victoria Sutton, who's a chiropractor working near Stratford-upon-Avon. She's snowed under with work, she's got a 3-month waiting list, and she's looking for an associate to help out. Osteopath or chiropractor, she's happy with both, so if you're interested in that, then look up the Victoria Sutton Clinic and give her a bell and maybe get the professions working together in that regard as well. Now, I had to read out Victoria's full name, otherwise you wouldn't be able to get in touch with her, but that's the only time I will do that. It's always been my policy on the show to read only the first names or no name at all if you tell me that's what you prefer. And I am very conscious that many people worry about revealing their identity when they're questioning anyone from the General Counsel. So be reassured, don't hold back this evening, but that said, please play nicely. My team of question handlers won't pass anything on to me which is rude or aggressive. We're here in a spirit of open and honest debate. And what's more, I'm taking Nick to dinner after the show and I don't want him glowering angrily at me over the soup and fish. So, no surprises. This evening's guest is Nick Jones, who's been the Chief Exec, aka the Registrar at the General Chiropractic Council for almost 7 years. Welcome to the APM studio, Nick. First time in the studio, I think, isn't it? Last time you were online when we did.
That's right. Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
Well, it's kind of you. You had to make the trip through some roadworks, I think, which added to the journey. On LinkedIn, the only thing you list as your profession is being the Chief Exec of the General Chiropractic Council. On your website, there's a limited bit about you. So I'm curious to know what your background is as the Registrar. Can you enlighten us?
I'll have a go. It's my favourite subject, talking about myself. So I didn't follow a career in a science-based discipline, but more a social science-based discipline. So on leaving university, my first job was as a trainee housing officer.
Right.
What
was your degree?
Social science.
Right.
In northwest of England.
Okay.
And after a couple of years, I decided I wanted to change the world and moved to London and got involved in a very innovative and new scheme to house homeless people, homeless families rather. So often coming in from as asylum seekers, and ensuring that they had somewhere nice to live, safe for their children, and access to schools and those other important things. And the reason I mention that is that was after I did that for a few years, I got involved in developing and bidding for new things, which involved putting proposals to what was then, I think, the Department of Environment. It's now the Department of Communities and Local Government, or the Office of Deputy Prime Minister. In other words, the Department for Housing. And that was my first brush with regulation in a sense, because they had to approve the proposal. And I recall vividly, I got not hauled up, but very deep level of questioning about the proposal. And I had a visceral kind of reaction against that. He was a bureaucrat sitting in their ivory tower, sort of undermining the proposals that we'd been put together.
This will be resonating with a few chiropractors.
Well, that's why I mention it, because I think there's a sort of everybody goes through that to some extent, and there's a reaction. It is a bit visceral, and I think that I worked through that to such an extent that I then saw a role at the regulator for social housing, which got me into the world of regulation.
Right.
So, if anything, my CV is as a regulator.
Okay.
Now that sounds a bit dry, and that sounds as if it's a heavy-handed bureaucracy, and that's what turns me on. It's not. I think sitting in the centre, as it were, as you do as a national regulator, and the GCC is a regulator for the United Kingdom, sitting in the centre gives you an opportunity to put the right levers in the system and to put some incentives in the system to generate improvement on behalf of patients and the public.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I get my passion in working with different sectors and professions in doing that. So having worked at the social housing regulator, I then went to work in the was the predecessor of the Care Quality Commission, and there's a variety of different organisations before the Care Quality Commission came about, and that was a fantastic opportunity to look at healthcare in its widest sense. So starting to think about how do you inspect GP premises, mental health units, the private sector, social care.
And the CQC, and therefore its predecessors, is probably held in the same regard by the medical profession as Ofsted by the teaching profession, isn't it? They hate it.
Indeed.
And actually there was a report sent out by the General Osteopathic Council only a few days ago saying that 35% of the osteopathic profession associate the word fear with the General Council. Yeah. So, you had an experience on the other end of the regulator. What do you do to try and mitigate that? Yeah,
I think you're right. It's a natural sort of reaction, which is why I emphasise the visceral experience that I had. And I think we spend a lot of our time thinking about how we can be approachable, how we can be customer facing. We don't always get that right.
Who's your customer?
The public.
Exactly. That, of course, is often lost on practitioners.
Indeed. And what I say on that, and I've said it quite a lot this year in relation to some work we've been doing around thinking about our new standards, is that we don't work in the chiropractor's interests, but we try not to work against it.
Right.
We've been established by Parliament. So going back to your point about the fear or the hatred of regulatory bodies, it's Parliament who's established us by statute. And our job is to regulate proportionately, sensitively, taking into account the views of all the stakeholders, and to try and do that in a humane and effective way, and to try and establish a tone that is approachable and enables people to see that you have a job to do. And of course, if you end up in the bit that is not very pleasant, it isn't very pleasant. Yeah. And whilst there are some things we can do in that regard in terms of providing support.
The bit that isn't very pleasant, by that you're referring to the fitness to practice process, which can ultimately lead to the Professional Conduct Committee and effectively a court hearing.
Yeah. And what I'd say on that is, again, it's one of the bits in the Act which is very clear about the process that needs to be followed. At the GCC, there are now approaching 4,000 registrants. It's increasing every year, which is good to see, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of interactions and patient experiences every year. Yeah. Many thousands every day, and I think we fairly consistently receive about 70 complaints a year, which the GCC is bound to investigate.
And that's, again, I'm not here to sing the praises of the GCC or otherwise, but I think that is something, again, which is often lost on the practitioners, is that if someone makes a complaint, you have no choice but to go through the laid down procedure. It's not as though you can say this is clearly spurious or malicious. You have to go through the procedure. And yeah, we'll get onto the procedures a bit later on, I'm sure, because fitness to practice will be a big issue for chiropractors, as it is for osteopaths.
Yeah.
I suspect that people will wonder about the balance of your care for the public or developing the profession. But one question we have been asked already
Yep.
is, do you think it's appropriate, ideal or best that someone who is not a chiropractor is regulating the profession? Effectively administering the regulation. You don't set the rules.
It doesn't have to be a non-chiropractor. It could be a chiropractor. Of course, there's a recruitment process which would test the competencies that the council has established at any given time. I think one of the reasons why there's been some changes in the professional regulation framework since the establishment was that there's a general fear of the profession regulating itself, which is why there's all sorts of checks and balances involved, ensuring that there are lay people on the committees. But of course they work best when there are people from the profession involved as well. So, for example, the General Council has an equal mix of registrants and non-registrants, or lay people as they're called in the business. And I think that provides for a really good framework to enable a chiropractic voice and a non-chiropractic voice, acting, if you like, on behalf of patients and the public. So people who have seen chiropractors and people who have not yet thought about seeing a chiropractor.
It's always puzzled me slightly, that, and I habitually, for the sake of convenience, refer to the GCC as the General Council for chiropractors and the GOSC as the General Council when I'm talking to osteopaths. But it's not, is it? The General Council is actually the body you've just spoken about.
That's right.
And what influence, what influence does that have over the GCC?
Well, again, the General Council is established in statute. It says there will be a council of 12 with an equal mix, as I said before, and the council has the duty to set the strategy of the organisation, what its focus should be, to agree policies, standards, for example. So when the GCC revises education standards or the code of practice, then it's the council who will agree those. And they also hold the executive, and particularly me as the chief executive and registrar, to account. So the council meets on a quarterly basis and I produce the reports, my team produces the reports that enables the council to hold us to account. Now, in terms of involvement in fitness to practice, at an early stage, or as you say, the later stage when there's a formal process, then there is very little involvement. I have very little involvement in that. There is a system that's established. There's independent committees, and that independence is protected at all costs. And those decisions will go through. As the executive, our job in fitness to practice, for example, is to ensure that the case is handled well and the committees have the information it needs to carry out its work. We don't have any animus towards the chiropractor where that process goes on, although I imagine it feels like it, that the GCC is out to get me, as it were, but that's not our role. You said before, our responsibility is to take a complaint, and there are very few exceptions to us not being able to look at it. I'd like a bit more flexibility there, and there's been some steps over the last few years. We talk about regulatory reform, and that's been on the blocks now for 10 years.
But it's
more.
hard, isn't it? Because both yours and ours is an act of parliament, which takes a lot of work to change, and even the rules under which you operate take a parliamentary decision to change. So it's not easy to get parliamentary time for these
You're
things.
absolutely right. And the Act was established, both Acts were established in 1994, and they've changed very
I
little.
think we were 1993, actually. You're one ahead of me.
Okay. Well, very, very little.
But they're identical, aren't they?
They are identical.
Except for the word
There's a
osteopathic chiropractic.
few changes around that. They don't, for example, mention patient. They don't mention the internet. They don't mention a whole range of things that.
They mention the public, though, don't they, in terms of
yes,
protecting
to
the public?
Yeah.
One of the words that was taken out of both acts is the concept of promoting. The word
Correct.
promoting the professions was taken out, and your responsibility is now developing the profession.
right.
What the hell does that mean?
Yeah, well, it's a flexible concept. So we spend a lot of time thinking about developing the profession, and there's a kind of a spectrum from making sure that the education establishments are of a good standard, that there are enough of them, that we're working with them to ensure that the graduate outcomes are strong and effective, and graduates are coming out that are almost ready for work. But beyond that, there's things like the continuing professional development. There's the work that we can do behind the scenes somehow to maybe think about how chiropractors could be integrated perhaps in the public health framework and so on. So there's a range of things that we do, but I think it's a broad concept.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that, because on a number of occasions you said you think about things. What do you actually do to promote CPD or education or practice?
Well, we do a lot. We spend a lot of time and effort producing supplementary guidance and support to ensure that chiropractors are, and I know the Osteopathic Council do the same, ensure that beside the kind of code framework, there's a lot of supporting documentation and material on our website, on other platforms and so on, just to emphasize what needs to be done in certain areas. And we see that as a really sort of positive step, and something that we've really grown and developed over the last few years.
Before we came on air, we were talking about the fact that we're on air for 90 minutes, and we'll be having to talk about the questions. I'd never get so many questions so soon in a broadcast. Okay. And of course, none of them are in support of the GCC, as you can imagine. Well, they're not hostile, but I mean they're all sort of, why do you do this? I'm going to have to read a few of them out, or we won't get through them.
No, please do.
One that was interesting, I was thinking this earlier, Christina says, have you ever had chiropractic treatment?
No.
Right. That's interesting. Why? Have you always been perfectly fit, or are you scared stiff of chiropractors?
I've enjoyed good health, so I take care with my personal fitness and so on. I've never never had a serious illness or anything like that. I've been very, very lucky, but I work at it, and I have. I've wondered if I needed it, how I'd put that chiropractor in that position. So that's part of it. It would
be very awkward. Go and see an osteopath.
Yeah, well, by all means.
Because they won't know you, and they won't care that you're the chiropractor.
So that is part of the consideration.
Yeah. I mean, the questioner here says, it would be quite useful, because then you'd know what goes on. You wouldn't. You'd know what goes on in one chiropractor's treatment.
That said, I've spent quite a lot of time visiting clinics. Being the patients have been very generous in allowing me to observe. I've spoken to obviously lots and lots of chiropractors, so I've got a rough idea what goes on.
Okay, I'm sure you have. I mean, you can't have done 7 years nearly in your job without knowing roughly what goes on.
It's nearly 6. Just to correct.
I thought it was 6 years, 9 months.
2019.
Oh, okay, sorry, my mistake. That's right. Nikki says I should ask you about why the CPD year has been reduced to 11 months. And I've been puzzled by that as well. You used to give people a month's grace to get their reports done after the end of the year. Now they've got to have it all in on the deadline of the end of the year. What's the reason?
We haven't changed anything. What we've done is to be slightly stricter in the interpretation of when it needs to be.
Well, that's her point. By doing that, it means that
we still a month's grace. Yeah. But we really did it to just even out the year a bit for our teams. So a month ahead. Meant that it was starting to get into the retention period, which is obviously a very heavy time for our people. And I'm really, really conscious of our need to be as efficient as we can be to ensure that we're spending the fee pound as carefully as we can. So part of that is, as I mentioned before, we're increasing numbers. That means there's an increase in workload, and it's really important we just think about some of those things to even out the year for our team. We're a small organisation, and we obviously need to care for them, have their well-being in mind as well. So we brought it forward. That said, just to finish on the point, at the similar point last year, there were fewer submissions that had been made. So we think that we've worked hard on our communication, and that's been successful in terms of getting the message out there. And we're terrifically grateful to all registrants who go to the trouble of, submitting their record, doing so a little bit early.
So what happens then to the person who gets their last 4 hours of CPD in that last month and hasn't got time?
I don't think it's not that. We haven't shortened the time. It's just that we've asked for that submission bit to come in, and it's not so hard and fast in that regard.
Okay, so you're saying you can be flexible over that. It's not a fitness to practice issue if you fail to get the...
We're always flexible.
Okay.
I mean, on that...
It doesn't come across that way to the practitioners, not necessarily for the chiropractic council. They all feel that they're under pressure for this.
Yeah.
So some of them will be reassured. Yeah.
I hope so. And I just want to emphasise the point that CPD itself, it probably feels a little bit like another requirement from the regulator. I think,
speaking as a person who provides it, I hope not. But
no. And your values will be that this is part and parcel of being a registered professional, that we're learning all the time, and the more in which we can communicate that sort of tone, the better. Yeah. I think there are a small minority who see it as burdensome. This is not the business of the regulator to check on this, but we need to keep working on that and communicating that message.
And I would certainly go along with that. I've heard the same from the osteopathic profession, but I think if you want to hold your head up in the crowd of professional medical providers around the country, healthcare providers, you've got to be able to show that you're trying to keep current with the latest research into whatever it is you provide. Nick says that he doesn't agree that regulators don't work for the chiropractors, osteopaths as well. Yes, you're there to set and uphold standards, but you should also see yourselves as protecting correctly practicing therapists from rogue therapists purporting to be something they're not. It's a mind change thing and may well engender better feeling towards the regulator from those correctly operating therapists. Well, you do that to a certain extent, don't you? First of all, you can't call yourself a chiropractor if you aren't registered, but also that's sort of the point of the fitness to practice process, is that anyone who isn't doing it properly will suffer some sort of sanction. I'm not sure. Nick, if you can come back to us with something perhaps a little bit more concrete on what you mean by that. What do you mean by a rogue therapist, unless you know, Nick?
No, I think where Nick's maybe coming from is where we talked earlier on about who we see as our customer, and of course Parliament expects us to protect the public. The whole framework of professional regulation is around protection of the public, but of course we can't do our work, and we can't do our work well unless we have a really strong and positive dialogue with registrants and the representatives of registrants, whatever that looks like. And we listen. We have to listen, and we have to act on that. We don't always respond in the way that, a bit like the CPD question, maybe people see us as inflexible, but at least we understand the issues, and we can react. But when we're taking action against practitioners who are holding themselves out as chiropractors, and mercifully there are very few of those. There are slightly more where they've perhaps deregistered and haven't been quite as diligent as they might be in terms of updating not just their own website presence, but these third-party things which seem to go on for years and years, things like yell.com, where it shows as the chiropractor in this place. And I think people latch on to that. It's quite difficult for any individual to get those sorts of things changed. But where we see rogue practitioners holding themselves out as chiropractors, it's a very serious matter, and it's a breach of the law. So therefore you can expect us to take action on that. And as you say, Steve, when it comes to poor practice, whether that's rogue or not, when it comes to poor practice, we don't have an inspection framework. We don't really know what goes on all the time. We're not geared up for that. So the only route in which that kind of gets surfaced is via the complaint system. And of course, there are many complaints which are dealt with before they come to us in the clinic's complaint system or dealt with by the professional associations. But I think when they come to us, then obviously society expects us to look at that and to take robust action where necessary.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think it's a problem for the profession that you've got so many professional bodies, trade bodies as you might call them? I mean, there's only really one for the osteopathic profession, which makes it obvious who people should get in touch with.
Yeah, it's for the profession. That's the first thing I should say. Equally, I look upon the Osteopathic Council with a little bit of envy in dealing with the institute, which seems a more straightforward sort of relationship. As I say, it's for the profession, and I think
there's probably pure chance that there's only one for the osteopathic profession. I don't know. I don't think it's any deliberate policy that's been pursued.
No, and I think these things happen. You know, they come about, don't they? And it's quite difficult to then shift into a different.
It would be nice if your we're going to call them trade bodies. It'd be nice if they got on a bit better together, I think. Professional
associations, and you know, I've certainly observed over the last few years some really good dialogue between them and so on. So you know, it's not always how you might perceive it to be.
Christina says, why can't chiropractors claim as CPD things that develop their profession any longer? And I think she means by that learning how to run your business or learning how to do your marketing. I think it was, 3 or 4 years, maybe longer than that you stopped them being ever allowed to claim that.
Yeah, I think we're not anti-business, but I think we deal with individual registrants, and it's important that, you know, the focus is on care, clinical care, and that encompasses quite a broad set of things anyway. So
I did get a sense that at one point some people were claiming an awful lot of marketing training or whatever else as being their CPD.
I imagine that possibly before my time. Just on CPD's cropped up a couple of times now. I think this goes back to the flexibility that we have. So you mentioned that the rules around CPD have been established now for 25 years. They're not as I would like to have them.
Right.
You know, I would really enjoy a dialogue with the profession about, you know, what does it mean to keep your professional development updated and continuing in a modern day setting. What would work for you as a profession? How can we work with you on establishing a scheme that can give confidence to patients and the public about how well you're keeping up to date? You know, I often think when I'm stepping on the tarmac at Stansted, I hope to God the pilots kept their development up to date. You know, it's a very real thing in that regard, isn't it? And I think society expects people in clinical settings to have kept their practice up to date. Is this current CPD system perfect? Far from it. You know, I really understand that. But it's the one we've got. And without parliamentary time, and I'm afraid the osteopaths and the chiropractors are probably at the end of the queue in that regard.
Well, the osteopaths, of course, had a major change in their CPD system a few years ago, about 6 years ago now, I think, which has led to, obviously there were some concerns to start with, but I think it's a system which is easier for the General Osteopathic Council to manage because they do less of it themselves now. They still have to do the audits and so on. And I don't know whether that's a route you might follow if you could, but obviously you can't unless you've got that parliamentary time.
No, we don't want to raise hopes until we've got more prospects of being able to make those changes.
Well, I was going to get onto this later in the show, but since we've started to talk about CPD, of course, a lot of this is about meeting the professional standards set out in the chiropractic code.
Yeah.
Now, at the moment, you've got a chiropractic code with something like 39 standards in it, and your proposed document, which I've got here, wants to move to an extra 2 principles and go to 81 standards. Why? Why on earth would you go to 81 standards? Osteopathy has 29. The GMC has 35.
Well, we had a good look at the current code of practice, and we undertook a scoping review to see what was.
This is someone with too much time on his hands, surely.
No, not at all. It's important that, I mean, the fundamental role of the regulator is to establish standards, and those standards have to be right for the environment in which those standards operate.
Yeah.
And whilst there's much positive about the current standards, the 2016 Code of Practice, we thought that there were some bits that weren't fully addressed, mainly as a consequence of the passage of time. So things get a little bit out of date. I think what you're saying is, in looking at them, you should take the opportunity to reduce and so on. But we couldn't see any opportunities to think about kind of taking some out. They just seem so fundamentally important. But we did want to establish some new principles around safety and the philosophy of safe care and the importance of safe care, and also a new principle around kind of collaboration, recognizing
doctors do that?
Recognizing that healthcare is a collaborative enterprise, both with the patient and with other.
But don't doctors do that? And they've only got 35 standards.
Well, it's different standards for different professions. I would argue there aren't too many. We've just finished the consultation exercise for that, Steve. We were very pleased to see we've received over 100 submissions. We'll be looking at those carefully, and we'll be seeing whether or not there's an argument that comes back. We've got too many, or they're too detailed, or what. But essentially, it's the council's decision on this, and they'll be coming to their views at the end of the year.
I'm not going to challenge you on this, but do you seriously imagine that any chiropractor knows the current chiropractic standards by heart, let alone 81?
I'm convinced that 95% of chiropractors have the Code of Practice on their bedside tables.
Yeah.
No, of course I know that's
Of
not
course
the
they do,
case.
yeah.
But I think they know broadly what it encompasses. And they, at this time of the cycle, if you like, they'll understand some of the changes. So those on the call will have heard me talk about the philosophy of safe care, and about the importance of collaborative health and care. And, they will be hopefully it'll pique their interest in thinking, well, what are the GCC up to? But I absolutely know this is not front and centre of everyone's minds all the time. But equally, as a registered health and care professional, one needs to have an awareness of the standards.
So you've introduced two new principles. One is called B and the other is called H. So they replace two existing ones, but those just get shunted elsewhere. And there's a certain amount of renaming and reshuffling of deck chairs involved in this. But what about principle H, particularly H4, which is demonstrate leadership? How on earth does a sole practitioner demonstrate leadership, and why is that important in healthcare? Who are they leading?
Well, we've done a lot of work on that to demonstrate why that's important. So there's a section on the GCC website which talks about the importance of personal leadership as well as leading within a team. We think that's...
Sorry, what's personal leadership?
Well, it's demonstrating that you embrace the requirements of being a modern health and care professional, and you embrace the standards that fall within that.
I speak as a military man. I can't see any leadership in that at all.
Well, I tend not to agree.
Right, no, of course. And I'm very happy for you not to agree. It seems to me that a lot of people will be thinking this is another 50-odd sticks with which to beat the profession when something goes wrong. Yeah. When a patient complains, well, you didn't demonstrate enough leadership in my appointment. Actually, it's there. We should have done it.
Yeah, it comes back to something I said at the beginning, which is around establishing the tone and the framework in which registrants operate, if you like. And I think, as a concept, I accept that patients might not automatically assume that, seeing a sole practitioner, as it were, there's going to be leadership. But we have to think about other environments in which registrants work. So not just in clinical practice, they also work in education. They work, they're researchers and so on. So it's a broader concept. So this means, I think it is one that works in a clinical practice.
So this means then that the educational establishments will now be told to teach leadership. Or us chiropractors just supposed to know this? And I know from my own experience, it's not easy to learn leadership. It's not a natural skill.
No, and it's not part of the curriculum. It's not part of the education standards. But registrants who are working in education institutions have a duty, it seems to me, to demonstrate leadership on behalf of the profession. So it's a newish concept. I would say that it's an increasingly important one in all aspects of health and care, and one in which, you know, again, we'll have a good look at the responses and see what they say. And some of the feedback we've had is some of these things are quite difficult to measure and assess. I kind of accept that to one level, but I think as well, it's what do patients expect when they're walking into a clinic. So some of the standards are slightly less measurable than others. We kind of defend that for now, and I think they'll withstand the test of time, but we'll see.
Well, the consultation period's ended, hasn't it?
Just last week.
It's just recently ended. You can download the Code of Professional Practice. This is the proposed document, the consultation paper, from the GCC's website.
That's right.
It's worth a look, definitely worth a look. There's nothing you can do about it now, but it is worth a look. I did find it an interesting read, mainly because I was struck by the huge number of principles compared to other professions. You've probably answered this question already in a different form, but Nikki wants to know why we, chiropractors, can't move towards a more straightforward system, such as nurses whose registration lasts 3 years at a time and they don't have to submit an annual review every year. I suspect the answer is parliamentary time again. Not that you've chosen to do that anyway.
No. I think professional. I think we've looked in the past at having a 3-year CPD cycle, if you like, and that's something that, you know, we're simply not allowed to introduce. I would love, and the council would love, more flexibility in terms of establishing those rules for a you know, heading towards 2030 as we are. So, you know, what does that look like over the next few years?
So, I mean, if those things are worth pursuing, even though there isn't parliamentary time freely available to get it done, what's the process for you? I mean, are you sticking a marker in the parliamentary box to say we want to do this, so that at some point you can change the system?
There's a danger here I could bore on for another 10 minutes talking about the history of professional regulatory reform. I'll try not to, other than to say that the arrangements that are in place to enable the regulation of physician associates and anaesthesia associates by the GMC is the basis that could be applied to other regulators in due course. And in other words, the framework has been established now as a consequence of many years of discussion and so on. The problem with professional regulation of healthcare is that it doesn't really attract ministers that much when they're dealing with fires elsewhere. The NHS, for example, obviously consumes a great deal of ministerial time. The reform of professional regulation isn't necessarily a vote winner. So that said, officials have been working hard on it, and ministers, where necessary, put their signature on the bottom of it. So the prospect of change is quite high if it can be applied to the other regulators. And that process can now, I think, begin because we've got a new government in place, but also because the GMC, who enjoy this new flexibility, what's called the order to regulate those two professions, that's now in place. And the idea is that that's a template which can be applied to opticians, it can be applied to osteopaths, chiropractors, and so on. And it's whether or not there is a will in government to make those changes. I hope so. I really hope so. But in any event, the GCC, like all good public bodies, establishes a strategy. What's the focus for the next few years? Where do we want to put our discretionary effort? And our own strategy has just come to an end for 2022-24, and that was about establishing some solid frameworks in place, getting the patient voice involved in the GCC's activity a bit more, making sure we made good on our commitment to provide supporting guidance and information for the benefit of registrants and therefore the benefit of patients. So that's kind of coming to a close now, and we're thinking about our strategy to 2030. Now I know it sounds grandiose and so on in terms of thinking about a strategy, but actually maybe we do want to spend a little bit more time thinking about, and having a dialogue with the profession about what some of these new arrangements might look like, in order to develop the profession.
Yeah. Okay. To give you a chance to talk a bit more about the purpose of the council, I know you've got a number of factors that it might be worth just clarifying to let people know what the council, the General Chiropractic Council, is there to do. Obviously, we've talked about one, which is protecting patients. We've talked about another, which is developing the profession. What else are your main activities? Because you only have 18 people employed at the GCC, I think. Is that right?
That's right. There are 18 of us, so we punch, I think, above our weight, in that we have the same duties and the same responsibilities that the Nursing and Midwifery Council has. Now, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, they register practically 1% of the UK population. I think it's 900, coming up to 900,000 nurses and midwives. And everything that they do, the responsibilities that they have, are the same as ours.
But you're saying they've got more staff to do it because they're wealthier?
Of course. And I can say that they've got more people in their in-house catering team than we have at the GCC as a whole.
Right. Okay. So what else are you guys doing at the GCC?
So we have a statute establishes what we have to do. So we have to, as you say, regulate and develop the profession, whatever that looks like. Fundamentally, setting the standards. So not just in the Code of Professional Practice, but also the standards for education providers. And those were improved and introduced a couple of years ago. And at the last council meeting in September, September, losing track of time. The last council meeting in September, we were able to report, having conducted reviews of each of those establishments, that they have successfully implemented those new education standards, with a view to ensuring that registrants coming out of those institutions are fit to practice, essentially. Yeah. So that's in place. We have a duty to remove registrants who are unfit to practice, which is why it's called the fitness to practice process, to establish whether or not people are unfit. I mentioned before there are about 70 complaints which are processed and considered every year. Those take longer than I'd like.
I think the median time is 108 weeks, isn't it?
Well, that's from end to end.
Yes,
so that's from the receiver complaint to the professional conduct committee consideration.
Absolutely, so but that is the time that the registrant will know about it and worry about it.
Indeed, and it's a ghastly experience.
It's a hideous experience. Yeah. How do you shorten the time? 2 years is an unbelievable time to live under the threat of removal from the register. Often
we're in the hands of others, so there are what you call third-party involvement. That could be the police, for example. It could be the coroners. It could be others. So that's somewhat out of our control. There are some kind of procedural things which just have to take time. So you have to give the registrant time to respond to the allegations, and then you put those to the complainant, and then the complainant, the registrant gets a chance to have a look at that. And then there are things like administrative hurdles around getting the panel together and the defence team. There are a small number of defence organisations involved in chiropractic, and I believe in osteopathy. And understandably, the registrants wants the Defence Council to be available on that day. We're sometimes saying, well, if you're not available, we still want to push ahead with it. So there are kind of pressures in that regard. So as you say, 2 years is a long time. I would like that to be shorter, but it's quite difficult to do so. That said, of the 70 in any given year, probably only about 4 or 5 of those will end up in what you might call a serious sanction at the end of the day. So it's a lot of effort to get to that place. Important to get to that place, but it's.
And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the the General Chiropractic Council is at fault in this any more than the General Osteopathic Council, because of course you don't know until the end of the process whether you're going to suffer a serious sanction or not.
No.
And I have sat in on procedures. I've sat in at procedures at both councils, but I've certainly seen some go through General Osteopathic Council's Professional Conduct Committee where the sanction at the end of it was ridiculous. It was out of all proportion to what was being alleged and was then subsequently overturned. So it's a nerve-wracking experience for everyone concerned, isn't it?
And just to go back to the potential for reform, a key component of that reform is to essentially make that process much shorter. Have to balance the concerns raised by the complainant, but in essence, we think that across the piece in other professions, that we can dispatch or can deal with many more cases by what's called a case examiner approach, which is a single official, as it were.
And you're allowed to do this?
Yes. Well,
right.
We're not allowed to.
Is this what the Osteopathic Council calls screeners?
No. This is subject on reform coming to pass. Mm-hmm. So this is some way off yet. I'm holding this as a possibility at this stage. This is not cast iron, but and some of the councils have got this power already. I go back to the fact that chiropractors and the osteopaths are at the end of the queue. So a case examiner essentially looks at the case and determines with the complainant and the registrant what an appropriate sanction might look like. It's not plea bargaining, but it's a slightly it's a much quicker process and a more humane process.
One of the things I came across recently with fitness to practice at the General Osteopathic Council was that people who had unwittingly allowed their indemnity insurance to lapse, and I think probably, I don't know if it's the same with chiropractors, but with osteopaths, indemnity insurance might not end at the same time as their registration year ends, and it's very easy to miss the emails or whatever. But they've got a certain procedure, Section 7A, I think it's called, where actually they don't have a PCC hearing, they just accept the decision. We know it's unacceptable professional conduct, it's going to be a sanction, but it's only going to be an admonishment because clearly it was unintentional. That must presumably relieve the weight on the PCC, so would help to speed the process. Do you do the same or similar?
There are certainly abbreviated procedures you can follow for those sorts of administrative things. It's often in discussion with the defence team. That said, very few of those. The majority are conduct issues and clinical care issues. So by the time it gets to the Professional Conduct Committee, and I accept that there are some, not found, probably an equal number found and not found, but that has to be determined based on the evidence and cross-examination and so on. So, there is a process. It plays out. It's not pleasant. There's a good deal of research now emerging that it's not particularly effective or, certainly unpleasant for all sides. And it's particularly difficult for complainants, let's say in a sexual boundaries case, to have to make a complaint to experience it in the first place, to then make a complaint about it to the regulator, for that then to be raked over at an investigating committee stage, and then potentially to have to replay that evidence in person, under cross-examination. So it's kind of, let's say it's found, then it's abuse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times that they've had to experience. So there has to be a better way.
Yeah, indeed. A very prominent defence barrister, who you would know, told me when we were in conversation not long ago that one thing that your council does differently to the GEOSC, and this is not a compare one against the other, we're better than you or anything like that, is that when a complaint is made about advertising standards, the General Osteopathic Council says, great, that's an ICO responsibility, or an ASA responsibility, they can deal with that. And of course it is, but he says that they don't pursue it, whereas the GCC does pursue it in addition to the Advertising Standards Authority, which must take up time and resources.
Yeah, thankfully, I think we're through the worst of that. So when I joined the GCC, it was still dealing with a reasonably long tail from a very long tail of complaints that had been made en masse. most of those complaints did not end up at a formal stage.
Right.
So I believe that the approach we've got now is that we have to consider it. Our advice is, and this comes back to slightly different arrangements, that possibly even different legal advice that's been obtained. Goodness knows we've tried, but our approach on advertising is to take a fairly proportionate approach as much as we can, which is basically to say, this is the complaint, put it before the investigating committee, and by the time it gets to the investigating committee, hopefully it's been changed. So it's a similar sort of approach, but one that we think that that's the minimum we can deal with. Okay. It's quite serious. I think it's quite serious to potentially misrepresent what you should and shouldn't say as regards your clinical care.
It is,
so it's non-trivial.
But there is another body that deals with that.
There is, but equally we think that that's ours as well.
Okay. Now, I've got a very lengthy question here, so I'm hoping that my team won't muck around with my question list and then I'll lose my... No, they've just mucked around with it already. So please leave my question list alone for the moment. I need to read through this one. It's anonymous. It is a lady who says that she felt that in a previous webinar that you've done, you seem to feel very much that the patient has all the rights and the chiropractor none. The GCC's job is one of regulation, gave the impression that meant protecting the patients from chiropractors. But this, she felt, was dismissive of female chiropractors working alone. Chiropractors must discuss in detail the reasons for discontinuing treatment for a patient and or denying treatment in the first place. So a female chiropractor, alone in a building with a male patient who is enjoying her discomfort or fear, must sit down and tell him that this is a problem and expect him to leave. She points out that one of the common responses to a woman being raped is to freeze, with all the subsequent issues with the legal system should the woman be brave or foolhardy enough to make a complaint, and with feelings of personal guilt. She says, we have just done a cycle of compulsory EDI training, and yet the GCC seem unaware of the women within the profession and their needs. Now, okay, she's not neglecting the fact that men can also be in these situations, but women are more commonly. She's got some other points in here, I think. She is a relatively small and she's upper middle-aged lady. I can say that because she's younger than me. And she's got 20 experience, no complaints. She says it's a sensible precaution to only offer new male patients daytime appointments when other people are in the building and within shouting distance. And of course, that must be, if it makes her feel comfortable, that must make for better treatment, I'd have thought. If a patient makes me feel uncomfortable, she says, which has happened a handful of times over the years, and it's been very, very scary, she's suggested to them she's not the right person for their problem and referred them to a male practitioner with the consequent minor risk to her reputation. So how do you respond to that? The nub of it is, how free is a female practitioner to say to a person, you need to see someone else, without having to go into detail why?
I recognise this as a very challenging issue. I don't recall kind of alluding to this or covering this topic in any of the webinars. It might be implicit in something I said, but it was not my intention to dismiss anything in relation to that. It's tough, isn't it?
It is very. Yeah.
Being a lone practitioner is a difficult place to be, it seems to me, not one I have any experience of. And the clinician is made vulnerable by their circumstances.
Yes.
And I haven't got any, offhand responses about what to do. But this has come up in the consultation on the code of practice. It came up at some of the webinars about cessation of practice. And there's somehow a belief that you can't end the arrangement with the patient for fear that the GCC will be on your back.
Right.
I think our position is that it is for the clinician to determine what's the therapeutic relationship.
Right.
And to be able to discuss that in collaboration. That's the new principle, in collaboration with the patient.
The new principle as in the code that's not yet approved.
That's right.
So,
well, there is already stuff in the code about, discussing with patients.
Yes,
their needs
exactly,
and so on
discussing
and so
with the
forth.
patient.
But this kind of emphasises that therapeutic relationship in a wider way. So
I think
I haven't got any pearls of wisdom on this, other than that it is absolutely for the practitioner to work with the patient as far as possible.
Yes.
But of course, when it comes to personal safety, that has to take priority.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suspect that would be well thought of if it ever got to the complaint stage.
Yeah.
But clearly that particular practitioner needs to show some leadership and have a talk to herself.
I won't respond to that.
No. I hope she'll take that in the vein it was intended. Osteopaths asked, do you have the same rules as osteopathy, that the word chiropractor is protected but not chiropractic techniques?
Yeah, it's tricky, that one. I think the whole issue of Section 32, as we know it, which is the section in the Act which says chiropractic, but you could use... We prefer that people don't use chiropractic techniques, but it's a bit like, for example, someone who has a chiropractic qualification from an approved program. We can't deny that. So they could have deregistered, but have that on their website. It's true. We can't escape from that fact. So it is quite tricky for us to take, really formal action. Under Section 32, we've taken a few over the last few years, but it is a very tricky area. And again, with more freedom and flexibility through being able to establish our own rules, then in future that could give us a bit more a bit more teeth.
I mean, to put another slant on that, I mean, I wonder how much the profession would appreciate it if you went down the route of pursuing everybody who used the word chiropractic at any point in their websites, and you didn't think it was fair, because it must cost a lot of money, wouldn't it? And you're not a wealthy organisation.
No, but it might send a signal to those who aren't chiropractors that the regulator is active. Yeah. Yeah,
if you won.
Well,
and lawyers are good at doing what lawyers do, aren't they?
It is tough.
And I think the BCA learned a lesson over Simon Singh on that one, didn't they? And I'm not saying that they were wrong to do it, but it ended up ending badly for them.
But equally, I know that this is an issue that chiropractors see, and it's a visceral reaction to that. Why should I go through all this trouble and pay my fees when these people are just sort of advertising anything? But it's, as you say, there's a realism to this, which means that, often when we poke, then it stops. And people do make the change.
Just going back to the new code of practice, Hayley says, when do you expect it to be published? Or
So,
when will it come into force?
Into force. So this is a good question, Hayley. I think I know that the council will be considering the final version in December, subject to that agreement. Then the code will then come into effect, will be formally introduced from the 1st of January 2025, but there's a 12-month grace period, which means that it won't come into effect formally, as it were, in terms of the standards which we expect until the 1st of January 2026. So we will be spending next year in promoting the fact that the code has changed and ensuring that all the supporting guidance and toolkits and so on, and supporting information available to committees and so on, is consistent with the requirements of the new code.
Okay. That was me, silly me, thinking it would come into effect at the start of the CPD year so everyone could address their CPD to the new code.
Well, there we are.
Yeah. We here at APM, I mean, we try to address, actually we do for osteopaths, we for those who choose this particular service, we try to make sure that they are kept on track with the CPD requirements, whatever they are, whether it's reflective practice, whatever else. Obviously, you can't endorse what we do as a business here, but that presumably is something which is very helpful for the profession.
I like the idea of the system being involved in the development of the profession. So with the system, I would say, is for chiropractic, it's us, it's the Royal College of Chiropractors, it's the professional associations, and it's it's registrants as a whole. And I think the more the system can work together, so we put a pebble in the pond, and then the RCC and the associations pick that up and work with it. So I can't endorse you, as you know.
No, of course not. No,
but the more that we're sort of in symbiosis with each other, the better it seems to me.
Well, there is a waiting list now for chiropractors. We're opening the same service to chiropractors as we do to osteopaths, where we will monitor, we'll do everything for them for their CPD other than do the CPD. We'll provide it, but everything else. They can find that on our website. There's been a couple of questions here about relationships with other professions, and I've lost one of the questions, but it's basically about one of the, anyway. A lady says, I'm not going to read her name because it's a distinctive name, the role of the GCC is to protect patients, and I'm sure most of the delegates here can give anecdotal evidence that the patient's interest is not being served by the other professionals, GPs and physios, telling our patients that to stop having treatment with us, which may be proceeding very successfully. Because we don't know what they're saying it because they say we don't know what we're doing, we're just after the money, or that we're quacks, no scientific background. Surely the GCC in its meetings with other regulators should be educating them that the patient's best interest is continuing with a route that is getting results with educated professionals. And that's one of many questions about how do you influence the other medical bodies through their regulators to stop them being dismissive of chiropractic.
Look, I think it's a really good point and an important question, and I hear it. I've heard it several times over the last few weeks and months as we've been having discussions about the new code. I think it depends on the tone and the content of what's being said and written and so on. But on the face of it, it's unprofessional, and it's something that should be brought to the attention of the person who's saying it or doing it, and if necessary, brought to the attention of the regulatory body of the profession concerned. I think it is totally unprofessional to be saying that.
And it's certainly part of our code, and probably our equivalent of the code, that you must be respectful towards other professions.
Indeed. And what I've observed over the last few years as I've been going out to some of the education institutions is the way in which graduates are hold themselves, the maturity, the self-confidence that they have.
Yes.
And it's absolutely vital that they're joining a profession, having worked often alongside other disciplines in their undergraduate study. There is more and more of that going on. So I think in terms of the future, it's a bit more promising. But there are antediluvian attitudes that are held by some professions, and that is totally unprofessional. As regards to what I can do about it, this is, it is fairly limited. But what I can say is that I am very lucky to have been elected as the chair of the group of chief executives of regulatory bodies, and that's a forum that meets on a monthly basis. I think registrants and the public expect us to talk to each other, and we do. And I chair that group, and that's a privileged position to have. And it's good for the General Chiropractic Council that we've been entrusted through me to carry out that role. And it's certainly a discussion that we have in terms of attitudes and so on. Is if it's a doctor, are the GMC going to listen to me? Well, they'll listen with interest, but there's potential in communication to their professionals, if you like, as to those expectations. But
it's very hard to change the opinions of people who are registered with them, isn't it? I mean, I said to you before we came on air, I think I was once a part of a GP's website, forum, and the language, the terminology and so on that they were using was very, very, not about us, but just generally was very unprofessional. So you can only do your best, obviously.
Maybe they need to show a little bit more leadership.
Maybe they do. I could run some courses. It's part of our CPD.
Maybe we should run some
CPD leadership courses. A couple have asked, that was a good one, thank you. That was a couple of people have asked about whether, if the GCC protects the public, who protects the chiropractor? And you must be asked this all the time. And what can you say?
Yeah, it's like I say, we try not to act against the interest of chiropractors. We've been established by Parliament not to make life difficult for chiropractors, but essentially to protect the public, and we do that. We absolutely know that the GCC is not on the minds of a jobbing chiropractor 24 hours. It's an episodic relationship, and it's often felt viscerally, like I said at the beginning, in terms of we do no good, or we don't add any value, and all of those things. I know those things happen. I prefer it not to be the case, but I absolutely understand that. But we have to have a humility in terms of what we can and can't do, and that role is played very effectively by the professional associations. And I'm in constant dialogue. Over the last few days, I've met with the presidents of 3 of those as part of my routine dialogue with them, and I'm hearing that. But it's kind of their job,
Yes.
and to represent their membership. And they do that. They work hard
Yes.
on behalf of the membership. And, I'd like that to your audience to hear that, because they do work hard.
No, I have some good friends running organisations, and I'm full of admiration for what they do.
Yeah.
And actually, I have a number of members who will say that we do the same in trying to help people through the process. But of course, there's no way of circumventing it once the process has begun. An analogy, it's an imperfect analogy, but one that I use with people quite often, is that in a small way, it's no different to the Crown Prosecution Service. If something is court-worthy, judged by the Director of Public Prosecution, then it goes to court. And the Crown Prosecution Service will pay for that process to happen. Yeah. And you, as the defendant, will have to pay for your defence.
Indeed.
Which is what your insurance company is for, of course.
Yeah.
And that process can take a long time as well. Yeah. But at least we've got professional bodies who can give us some support. Indeed.
And it is really difficult if a registrant is defending themselves.
Yes.
It's tough for them.
Yeah.
And I would strongly urge all registrants to ensure they've got appropriate cover through their membership of associations or elsewhere, to ensure they're not caught in that position. As I've said before, it's a mercifully small number, but if you find yourself in that place, it's tough. And the last thing you want to be worrying about is your ability to defend yourself.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have found recently, I can only speak from what we have done in my organisation, but I know that the other professional bodies will do the same thing, is that it's extraordinarily important to have somebody you can talk to throughout that process, because you can't talk to them. You haven't got the time, but it's not your job. The PCC isn't going to talk to them because it's a judicial process, effectively. But having somebody who understands the process and can explain what's going on, and of course you've got the support mechanisms available if people choose to take them up.
We do.
Just take advantage of them, because it's a horrible process, isn't it? Haley has a question about directed focused CPD. Last year, people were told to do reflective practice on equality, diversity and inclusion.
Right.
GOSC has given it a new title this year. It's different, and they've included belonging as well. So, I mean, it's just,
I've seen that.
I know.
As part of their new strategy.
Yes, indeed. Haley says, how is it this year? It's professional candour.
That's right.
If that hasn't gone through Parliament, is it not compulsory? Do we not have to do that?
Well, we think it's a requirement, so we've set it out as a requirement. We think to have that focus every year is a good thing, and I think it enables people to reflect on that as a particular topic. We don't think it's overly onerous. We do think that the professional associations and the Royal College and so on come on the back of that and produce some
As do we.
Some good material. Other products are available.
Indeed.
And that's a good thing. So I go back to my pilot analogy. It's important that people kept up to speed on the generality, but also some focused areas.
Interestingly, and I'm not simply trying to blow my own trumpet here or advertise my services here. You're very clear on your website that you don't promote individual companies, apart from one thing. You talk about first aid, and you say courses are available through the Royal College, and that's great. And you say, in particular, this company that provides first aid training, which I thought was, I don't mind if I can have my name added as well. That will be good, because we provide very good first aid training here.
Okay.
In fact,
I should have a look at that then, yeah. It might be a historical thing.
I'll buy you an extra pint over dinner.
I'm not easily bought.
Okay. Samon says there seems to be a number of chiropractors on. I can get this. I get this with osteopaths as well. A number of people on the fence about deregistration. It's not in your interests for chiropractors to deregister, and I would argue it's not in the public's interest for them to deregister either, because then they are, by definition, unregulated enough to do any training, or they could be of any quality. Do you think about this or a strategy in this regard? You obviously need to protect the public, but surely you need to maintain confidence from within the profession, and of course you've got to fund the GCC.
Yeah, so let me be clear, it's not my primary concern. That doesn't mean to say I don't care, but it's for the individual person to determine that. My job is not to keep the GCC afloat. It's not to generate more business. We are not a membership body. Let's be absolutely clear. I am the registrar, and my job is to register people onto the register who are fit and proper and qualified to come onto register, and that's a serious responsibility.
Are you seeing many deregistrations by people who are still practicing?
Well, let me tell you this. In the last 5 years, the register has grown by 500 or 600, which, and it's likely to grow in the next 5 years by significantly more than that, as a consequence of new programs, new educational programs, and an increase in the number of graduates, and a smaller number who are leaving the register.
Yeah.
So there's a net growth every year, and that's not the case in a lot of other professions. So I think I think registrants, not because of the GCC, but I think registrants value having a regulatory body that sits next to them, and it gives that confidence to the public that it is a regulated profession. I think it has a value.
It puts osteopaths on a level with
Absolutely
medical doctors and other healthcare professionals, doesn't it?
I mean,
I think it's quite important too that we have it. Actually, you've got a slide. There are 10 agencies registered with the PSA, or governed by the PSA, the Professional Services Authority, aren't there? Okay, how do you fare with the PSA, who are your supervisors, as it were?
Yeah, well, we enjoy an annual review every year, and because of my background in regulation, I haven't a visceral relationship with the PSA. It's one that I welcome. It's an audit. They look at us every year. Every third year they have a deeper dive into our activities, which they did last year, and we were very pleased to say that last year we met all 18 of the standards, and that's consequential of a deeper review. So they had a good look at all of those standards.
This year you dropped one.
This year we dropped one. We were sad about that. We weren't sad that the PSA scored us down, so it wasn't a question about the PSA's approach. It was a question that what you described earlier on, that length of time it took from dealing with a complaint from end to end had increased a little bit, and that's a factor. That's a public safety risk, as it were, if we're taking longer to deal with cases. And we've put in place a number of steps and activities that hopefully will mean that next year we meet all 18 again.
So the standard that you failed is that the regulator's process for examining and investigating cases is fair, proportionate, deals with cases as quickly as is whatever, and a fair resolution of the case ensures. But it was the time was the only issue.
I think it was the time, and I think that's one aspect of that particular standard. It's an important one.
Yes.
Don't duck it. We wish we could do them quicker. We're hopeful that this year we're in will show that. But what we're doing all the time is balancing the need to take the case forward carefully and to make sure that all the evidence is before the committee, and that does take time. And we think the slightly blunt instrument of timeliness needs to be seen in the round, and the Professional Standards Authority are considering their own standards this year, and one of the bits of feedback which we know they'll receive is if you're going to look at that standard, look at it more in the round.
Yeah. The only reason I brought it out was because the standard talks about fairness, and there's no question about the fairness of your process. It's purely that difficulty of shortening the process.
That's right. It's really difficult to do.
A question from MT, and I haven't read it, so I don't know where it goes. If medical doctors could be educated more effectively on the evidence base and regulation structure for chiropractors at an undergraduate level, good luck with that, because they've got no time in their syllabus any more than the rest of us, this would likely be the best point of contact. What steps could the GCC take to provide this information to medical schools to include in their modules on MSK medicine? Well, interestingly, we had a contract with the NHS, used to go to meetings. It was chaired by a GP who had MSK expertise. He'd done a specialist course in it, and he said that GPs have zero knowledge of MSK, so I don't think they get a lot in their undergraduate training.
I've heard that.
But he says leaving this to chiros to work the relationship to talk at medical school would mean only a small fraction of med schools getting exposure.
Well, this is a tricky one. I think us determining the curriculum for doctors is for the birds. You know, it's as you said, the coverage of MSK is fairly small, full stop.
Yes.
So I think the more that we can expose undergraduates to each other, I think has the potential for having an impact. And I know that in some of the programs now, physios, osteopaths and chiropractors are spending more time together, and that's got to be a good thing in terms of interdisciplinary learning. The other area that I think I'm very excited about is the prospect for chiropractors to be embedded in general practice, for example. So spending more time with doctors, GPs, and the word gets around. And that's happening, I think, in areas where there's some trust being developed between chiropractors and general practitioners. And I think the more we can replicate that sort of activity around the place, I think it's a generational thing. But the more in which that can be observed and seen, I think that's got a potential for breaking down some of those barriers. So I absolutely get it. But in terms of what can be done, what levers you can pull, I think is a really tricky one.
You must get very frustrated with the number of questions you get, but the relatively few, we haven't had any, number of suggestions that you get as how you could achieve these aims. And I'm not criticising any of our questioners because it's not their job.
No.
But of course, you're the poor guy who's stuck there getting all the flack.
That's all right.
Actually, you only have limited opportunities to achieve these things, and it isn't your job to promote the profession.
No, I think what ministers, what regulators can do is often much less than people think we can do. Right. There isn't a magic lever that you can pull to affect change. We often spend a lot of our time influencing. So I think I understand it from a very operational perspective. You know, why can't you do this? Why can't you do that?
Yeah.
I think the regulation is often an art, more than a science.
I'm going to take you back to the ASA and the CAP procedures. CAP is the Committee on Advertising Practice, which is a sister organisation to the Advertising Standards Authority, or agency, whichever they are. Chiropath says, Dr. Heidi Harvick's research shows that neurological brain changes from chiropractic care occur. How will you ensure these findings are reflected in the way chiropractors can communicate to their patients? Her findings are not included on the ASA or CAP guidance and have been considered misleading by many critics of the profession. I don't know if you're familiar with what Heidi Harvick has found.
Reasonably. And I think, you know, this is an emerging area across I'm very interested in the concept of pain and how that gets played out in physical manifestations of one sort or another. And I think to some extent the traditional medical model, if you like, has some catching up to do. I am very open to that concept. It would be really great for that to be discussed at and agreed, if you like, amongst the profession itself. And there are various schools and schools of thought within the profession itself. But if it was a profession-led initiative to the GCC, I'm very happy to go into bat in terms of that slightly wider framework of what's acceptable and what's not. I think there's some work to be done on that. And then the whole notion of evidence-based and evidence-informed and so on, I think is a tricky one, but it's certainly something that, again, as part of our strategy going forward. So ideas welcome on that. Is there a way in which we can open that up a little bit more? I'm very open to seeing the benefits of the interaction between the practitioner and the patient. You know, that half an hour conversation that just doesn't happen with the GP, for example. How does that play out? So, you know, there are opportunities there, I think.
But also, what you say to a patient in a treatment room is not governed by the ASA or the CAP.
No, we're not in the room.
No, they're not in the room. Obviously, you can't mislead patients. That would be a breach of professional standards. But you can talk about things like this. And actually, it'd be interesting asking your opinion on this. My advice particularly to osteopaths, and there's a reason why I'd suggest osteopaths are not so readily to chiropractors, is that if you've got a piece of evidence like this, and you're confident, you've looked at it, you've examined it, done what you say in your code of practice that you should be looking into and questioning research and so on, then you put it on your website and say it. And if someone complains and it's upheld by the ASA, then you can take it off. But if you had reasonable grounds, reasonable evidence to justify it, and it's not precluded by the advertising practice documents, and there is a document on the ASA's website which says what you must not say as an osteopath or a chiropractor, just as there's one that says this is what you can say. But there's stuff in between where if you've got evidence, then you can say it.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a dialogue that takes place there, and how much you play that out on your public documentation on the website and so on is for the practitioner, balancing a variety of risks and so on.
Yes.
But I think in terms of that dialogue with the patient, and the new code is quite explicit, or the proposed code is quite explicit about this, which is around sharing with the patient the limits of the evidence base, for example.
Yes.
But you've treated patients previously, and this has been their experience, and I'm sharing this with you, and you may or may not wish to proceed on this basis. But it's having that dialogue and being open about the limitations of the evidence.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. In terms of the limitation of the evidence, Scott has asked a very valid question. GPs can prescribe drugs off-label. They can try out stuff on their patients. So why is it that chiropractors and osteopaths, to the same extent, are constrained in what we're allowed to do?
That's the same point, isn't it? It's and I used to work in the world of infertility treatment, and there were quite a lot of drug treatments that were designed for one thing and were used for another, and that was a very contested territory, and it did often come back to good professional practice and the extent to which the supervising officer was involved in that. So it's a very live topic. It's one that I would go back to that relationship with the patient. I don't think we prescribe too many things, but in the back of the mind of the registrant has to be, how will this play out at a fitness to practice hearing? And it's about the validity of the offer, it's about the documentation in place, it's about the agreement with the patient and how well that's been documented. So I think don't want to promote defensive practice, but one has to be careful.
Yes. Oh, and at virtually every show we talk about the importance of documenting what you do with patients, and and we don't need to talk about, well, there's a whole avenue of consent to be gone down, which we don't have time for this evening, because I think the chiropractic code is, I don't expect it will be interpreted wrongly at the PCC level, but it could be misinterpreted in the way it talks about getting consent.
Yeah.
Dave asks what the structure of the GCC is. The GOSC is registered as a charity, for presumably financial tax reasons. Is it the same with the GCC? If not, why not? Are there advantages, disadvantages?
It's not. We don't think the advantages are that great. We're a peculiar body established only by Parliament. We're not a limited company, we're not a charity, we're not this or the other. We haven't really spent a lot of time looking at charitable status. It's possibly something we should have a look at again, but we don't think the advantages are that great.
Okay. Let's just see if we can get through this fairly lengthy one in the time we have left. Bonza says, some years ago I wrote a blog, How to Choose the Best Chiropractor, which I published on my little website. Within 24 hours, I removed the entire article. 1 year later, I had a complaint from the GCC. I suspect the complaint must have... Would you check people's websites? It would have had to come from somewhere else, I would have thought.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was obviously referred to, and he was notified by the GCC. No one could even find the original article, yet the spurious historical complaint was upheld and investigated. And apparently he'd mentioned the word subluxation once in the blog over 1 year previously, after many months of worry and so on. Oh, it was the Good Thinking Society. Of course it was. Run and paid for by a journalist. Well, we know about the Good Thinking Society. UCA solicitors were involved. The solicitors questioned the GCC's strict approach to investigate vexatious complaints. They said it happens all the time. Sorry, this is a lengthy one. When the BDA, BMA and other medical health committees have amended their guidance to weed out vexatious complaints at an early stage without wasting money, why does the GCC continue with this outdated practice? His words, not mine. It's clear the GCC does not wish to protect the chiropractor. What are you protecting the public from exactly? What's the benefit of persisting with this outdated legislation? Not the happiest of bunnies, I would suggest, but and I think I can anticipate some of your answers there.
Well, it comes down to the fact that if a complaint is made and if it fits, there are very few criteria that we can't investigate. We're obliged to look at it and to carry that investigation.
At what stage would a vexatious complaint be weeded out, or does that have? Is it not possible?
It's very difficult to determine what isn't vexatious. The expectation of our regulator, the Professional Standards Authority, is that we look at all complaints,
right.
and we consider them carefully.
Yeah.
The issue of vexatious is later down the line, and it's very rare that a case will be withdrawn from the investigating committee before the investigating committee have looked at it. It's the investigating committee will weigh up the facts, and our objective is to try and get cases to investigating committee as soon as we can. 90% of cases considered by the investigating committee are considered as no case to answer.
Right.
In other words, that's the end of the matter. Now, I know it's unpleasant to have got to that point, but
the time to get there is a lot quicker than getting to the PCC's
Indeed.
resolution.
Indeed.
That's a much shorter
a little
time
bit
frame, isn't it?
longer than we'd hoped, but we're working hard on getting that time down.
Nick, I hope you've enjoyed the process this evening. I hope you haven't felt that you've been
great.
too much under the hammer from everybody. It's been great to have you here, and really nice to have you in the studio for the first time. So I hope we'll get you back for shows in the future.
Be a pleasure.
Well, there you have it. If you aren't completely satisfied, I hope you're at least better informed about the way the GCC works and how it goes about its business.